All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. We are very excited today to have our third Future of Higher Education Forums. Today's talk is going to focus on measuring and communicating your research impact. We're very fortunate today to have two people very seasoned in this topic, Dean Bo Case and Dean Chris Ingersoll. They have vast experience in this particular topic, and I know they've got great things to share with you today. I also want to remind everyone that our last Future of Higher Education Forums will be on December 7th, and we have the topic of emotional intelligence. So if you're interested in that, please visit the website of the Office of the Provost. You can register for that forum. As always, we live stream all of our Future of Higher Education forums and archive them on the Provost website. So we have an exciting program for you this morning. Let's give them a warm welcome.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Chris Ingersoll, and that's Bo Case, in case you were having difficulty telling us apart. I'm going to kick us off a little bit with just an introduction to the topic, because the idea of using metrics to characterize your research impact is certainly not without controversy. And there's a fair amount of information. It's complicated. It's controversial. And I think one of the key messages out of this whole thing is that all of this has to be put into context. And that's where the value of this really comes into play, is when it's properly put into context. And I'll talk a little bit later about how it may be used inappropriately, and certainly Is that better? Thumbs up? Thumbs up, okay. So the context is a really important thing. And so we're gonna do kind of two things. We're going to talk a little bit about what those metrics are and how you might find them. We're going to try to talk about them in the context of a profession as an example, and then talk a little bit about how someone can put these in their statement within their dossier as they're going up for promotion tenure, and how to use this information. So that's the general ground that we're going to try to cover today. And then at the end, we'll have time for some questions as we move along. Okay. So the first thing that I want to point out is the document that determines whether or not you've met the criteria for promotion or tenure are delineated in your college and department elaborations. And that is the document that you really need to make sure that you're paying attention to when you're preparing these things. It is the responsibility of the candidate to make a compelling case that they've met the criteria described in the elaborations. Here at UT, we have both college level and we have department or school level elaborations, and candidates are responsible for meeting both. And the reason I bring that up is occasionally department level elaborations may have a little bit higher standard than what's in the college level thing. So it's important to pay attention. It's important to pay attention to that. When talking about professional activity or your research, it's not uncommon for words like quality, impact, or quantity to be included in there. So it may say you have to have so many publications that they have to make an impact in the field, or things of that nature. So those are important phrases and words to pay attention to in the elaborations as you begin to think about what your dossier might look like to make the case that you've met your elaborations. So again, they differ across colleges and departments, so it's really important to carefully read the ones that apply to you so that you know what it is that you need to demonstrate in your dossier. Next slide. So I want to talk about a couple of terms, because oftentimes you hear these used interchangeably, and they're probably not interchangeable, but you'll see both included in descriptions of expectations. So for the sake of the discussion, we'll operationally define them as follows, right? So quality is the standard of something as measured against other things of similar kind, or the degree of excellence of something. And can be an interesting conversation when you talk about quality, because we might talk about the elegance of the design of the paper, for example. And so it could actually be a very high quality study, but not be very important. So the idea of impact is that you have the effect of influence on one person, thing, or action on another. And so this tells you that people are paying attention to your work. Now, there's flaws in thinking about impact as well, especially when you use some of these measures. If someone cites a study a lot, for example, it could be because it's flawed, right? And people keep pointing out that mistake over and over and over again. Or it could be that this is a really groundbreaking idea that happens. And so this is why it's really important in the context of the dossier, not just to record the numbers that we're going to go through here, but also put them into context and convince the reader that this is quality, it's having impact, and it's important research, right? So that's a little bit harder to demonstrate that you've met that than it is the quantity. So if you have to have 10 publications, okay, here's the 10 publications, right? If you have to say they have impact or they have quality, that requires a little bit more convincing of the reader in the process. And so these metrics can certainly be one of the ways that you do that, although they have to be put into context. Yeah, next slide. All right, so I'm going to introduce the basic categories of the factors or the measurements that we're going to talk about, and then I'll turn it over to Dean Case to talk about. But essentially, we've divided these metrics up into 3 different categories. So there are metrics that relate to journals themselves. There are measurements that relate to the authors individually. And then there's our metrics that relate to the specific article and the impact that it may have. So I'll turn it over to Bo to discuss those.
So the first category we are going to look at is journal impact metrics. And I want to preface all of this by saying this is just a general overview of a variety of different metrics for journals, for authors, and for articles. Thank you. This isn't a fashion statement here. It's actually a part of my mic. I feel like a football coach on the sidelines. We're not going to look into the sausage making because that can be very complex and scary. If you want to know more, I would suggest contacting our library faculty. We have liaisons assigned to each college and sometimes the departments within a college. They can help you and your colleagues do a deep dive into some of these metrics. So journal impact metrics. There are pros and cons. People like to identify more cons than pros. There's lots of discussion of these metrics and their supposed flaws. I'll get into that in a minute. Pro is, these are well known, especially the journal impact factor that comes out of Web of Science by a company named now Clarivate, formerly called Thomson Reuters, formerly called the Institute for Scientific Information. They've been collecting citation data since the 1950s, so they have a long track record. And these metrics do help compare journals to other journals within a discipline, usually. And it can be taken as an indication of a journal's importance in a field. With a caveat that, again, I will get into in a minute. Cons, journal metrics are journal metrics. They're not article-level metrics. So even though one may be publishing in a journal that has a high impact factor, it doesn't mean that an author's particular article is impact-worthy. Cons also just depends on the size of the field. It depends on the definition of a field. I have a couple slides that will show some of these differences in a minute. Go forward. So the basics of journal impact metrics. It does essentially one thing. It measures the average number of citations that an article from that journal expects to receive. And they're all calculated a little bit differently. So that's it. The score is basically the average number of citations an article receives in a particular journal. That's all it does. It doesn't mean it's good or bad. But relatively, you may be able to make some judgments. The most popular, I said 3. I added a couple more last night. 5 most popular metrics are here. In no particular order other than I have slides forthcoming that makes it easier to view some of these things. But there's Schemago, there's SNP, which is a very cute name, Site Source, the standard journal impact factor, and the eigenfactor. So here is a table that attempts to describe just some of the differences between these different metrics. Again, they're all doing pretty much the same thing, average number of citations for an article from a particular journal. 3 of the metrics use data from Elsevier's Scopus product, and the other 2 use data from Clarivate's Web of Science product. There's tremendous overlap between those data sources, but they also index some unique things. There's something called the basis of the metric, and these terms actually come from Elsevier, so they're slightly biased. There are popularity metrics and prestige metrics. Basically what that means is not all citations are created equal. So the metrics that are using a prestige as opposed to popularity, the more important journals carry more weight in the prestige indexes, whereas the popularity indexes, all citations are counted as equal. They also vary in the citation window period. So to calculate that metric of the average number of citations an article would expect to get out of a particular journal is calculated using citation data over 2, 3, or 5 years, divided by the number of articles published in the year that's being scored. The equations can get much more complex for prestige factor. An eigenfactor also eliminates self-references to the same journal. But essentially, the core is the same. Number of citations over a certain period divided by the number of articles in the scored year equals the average number of citations. And a couple of these indexes try to normalize the data, taking into account that different disciplines have different citation behaviors. And also the sources of citations. Some of the indexes only look at certain kinds of citations, articles, papers, and reviews, as opposed to any kind of citation that may appear in a journal. Feel free to step in.
I think that becomes an important point when you're contextualizing that in terms of the sources, in terms of what's in there. And when we get a little bit deeper and we share some numbers, you'll see that the same index has a different value depending upon the source that it comes from. So it may be worth digging in that to know what the difference is between the sources that they're citing, and that may help you contextualize how your article may be being used in the literature, whether it's a book or an article, et cetera.
So we are going to look at the discipline of, and I put quotes around it, nursing. These disciplines are often defined by the data sources. They do generally a pretty good job, but scholars will disagree about what journals count in their field and what journals don't count. An extreme example is coming from the humanities, the field of history. I would argue that there is no such thing as a discipline of history. It's only sub-disciplines. There's American history, British history, Roman history, social history, political history, and so on. Yet all of these journals are lumped together in the same category of history. So it might be difficult for a history department to determine the prestige of any particular journal because apples and oranges might be thrown into the same fruit bowl to be evaluated. But nursing. Here are the different scores from the different metrics. And again, that number essentially means average number of citations an article would expect to have from that journal. And you see there is difference. Just looking at the top row, there are different scores based upon the different formulae that these metrics are using. And I also list, after the score, the ranking. So looking at journal impact factor, the category of nursing, a score of 1.635 ranks it number 33 in the list of nursing journals, which puts it in the second quartile. The number is a little bit different in site score. The number is higher. The ranking has then changed significantly. It's jumped up to number 15, putting it in the first quartile. So different metrics will produce different scores. We have a question.
Yeah, so on the first general clinical nursing, you have number 80 under SNP, quartile 1, and then number 33, quartile 2. Does that mean SNP has a whole bunch more journals that they're evaluating under the category of nursing?
The question is the rankings in the top line. There's a number 80 versus a number 33 and so on. Yes, either they're looking at more journals, they categorized more journals in that field, or I have a typo on my slide.
It's also that one is using the SCOPUS data, which indexes a lot more journals than
Yeah. So comment from the crowd is different data sources. The one that's ranked number 80 over here, SNP, is using Elsevier's Scopus product as opposed to Journal Impact Factor and Eigenfactor, which is using Clarivate's Web of Science data source. The data source is smaller, so the rankings would be adjusted upwards accordingly. And line 2 pretty much says the same thing. There's a little bit of movement of this journal. All the different metrics have the journal in the first quartile, all in the top 10. Although there is quite a bit of difference here, number 1 versus number 8. But it can get a little weirder than that. We'll go to the next slide. This is looking at 2 other, quote, nursing journals, midwifery and cancer nursing. The Scopus product puts these 2 journals into 2 different categories. There's a nursing category and subcategory of nursing called maternity and midwifery. So it's not really part of the nursing category, it's part of a subcategory that's a narrower field. The Scopus product also puts the journal midwifery into the category of medicine, subcategory obstetrics and gynecology. And if we look at the SJR rankings here, just looking at the nursing subdiscipline, the journal is number 3 in the first quartile. That's great. Number 3, that's better than number 47, right? 3 is better than 47? First quartile might be better than the second quartile? Not necessarily. I would say that you could argue that the fact that a nursing journal is competing against medical journals means something, to have your papers being viewed by more eyeballs in the greater discipline above nursing. Same here for cancer nursing. The nursing subcategory of oncology, the journal is ranked number 5, but when it's put in medicine, it falls into the second quartile still, but ranked number 168. I mean, 168, that doesn't sound so great. But again, I would argue, I think that is great to have your article published there because you're in the second quartile, you're in the top half of the best journals in oncology, not just nursing, but oncology. I think I'll leave it there. There are other journal quality indicators. For example, acceptance rate. It would mean something to be published in a journal that has a very low acceptance rate. Who's editing the journal? That's another prestige factor. We could say who publishes it. Is it part of the science group or nature group? Is a journal affiliated with some kind of institution? Also subscribers and circulation. And I have an anecdote I can share here. At my previous institution, one of my library faculty published in a not just non-peer-reviewed journal, but a trade journal, a popular trade journal, Atlantic Monthly. So that doesn't count as much usually for tenure and promotion because it's not a peer-reviewed journal. It's a magazine. However, she made the argument that it did mean something. She had an article published in a magazine that has several 100,000 subscribers. And her article was not behind a paywall. It was up front for the entire world to see, potentially millions of eyeballs on that article. And The Atlantic is a publication that's in a lot of library aggregator databases, making it even more possible for it to be discoverable. And we're going to get into alt metrics in a few minutes, but I'll start now, broach the subject. A lot of online articles like this also have the ability to share the article with someone else, email it to a colleague or a friend or family member. You can also like the article, and those are other metrics we can collect. So in this particular case, I think her contribution was tremendous despite having been outside of the typical scholarly peer-reviewed sources. Now, predatory journals. I have a definition of a predatory journal, and again, I love the quotes. A publisher exploiting our need to publish and to be recognized for our contributions for the sole purpose of profit. And usually these publishers have low standards in terms of oversight, editing, and production. We have a couple resources to share. There are a lot of library guides out there. I happen to like this one out of Iowa State. It gives a great overview of what predatory journals are. And our library here has access to a database called Cabell's. It's a publisher database. You can go up and look up particular publications. And Cabell's has 2 different products, the kind of good list and then the bad list of publishers. That second source we have just subscribed to. It should be available for you to search in the next week or so. A comment about this. Sometimes people confuse predatory journals with open access journals that charge fees. Open access journals that charge are not necessarily predatory journals. It happens to be predatory defined by the bad practices of the journal, not by the category that the journal might be classified in. Let's leave journal metrics and move on to author metrics. So there's a lot of controversy and discussion about journal metrics. There's even more for the author metrics. Proceed. Pros. Well, just like journal metrics, I would say that these are well-known standard measures, kind of. Your score can demonstrate that you have influence and impact. It's still based upon citations. Cons, just as with journals, the scores are measuring one thing. It's essentially citation data, which doesn't necessarily indicate quality. It does indicate quantity. And there's some differences across the tools. There are two popular measures, the H-index and the I-index. There are a few other flavors. Just like with the journal impact factor, it had been around a long time. It had its critics, and all those other metrics, schemago and eigenfactor, came about to, in a way, to make the data cleaner or more meaningful. I'm not sure it succeeded, but that was the reason behind it. The same here with multiple different matrices for author impact. We can go forward. And just as with journal metrics, there are differences with the author metrics, and it depends on your data sources. So Scott's question about why is this journal ranked 80 here and number 33 here, it's the data source behind it. So looking at one of my favorite authors, C.D. Ingersoll, Google Scholar has an H-index of 53, but Scopus has an H-index of 37. And I put the raw number of citations here. That is another metric. Having thousands of citations is a good thing to report on. Again, depending on your discipline. The field of Greek, let's be even narrower, Byzantine Greek manuscript studies, we would expect to see double-digit, maybe triple-digit citation figures. The I-index is an interesting index. It's produced out of Google Scholar. And what it measures is the number of papers an author has published who has received at least 10 citations in those papers. So C.D. Ingersoll has 133 papers with that author name attached to it that have received 10 or more citations. Whereas H-index, what that is measuring is the value means there are 53 papers with 53 citations. Both these indexes are valuable for more established scholars. The longer you're around, the higher your number. Charles Darwin's number keeps going up. He's in 400s or 500s. Not everyone will find value in these. Humanists and artists probably won't find as much value in these matrices. So why is Google twice as much? Well, they're collecting data on a whole lot more sources. Web of Science and Scopus are really only looking at research journals, scientific literature. Google's including a whole lot of other things, which might be a good thing. Textbooks, for example, are being mined for citation data. And you could argue that that is a valuable thing. I'll let Dean Ingersoll take over ResearchGate here. And this is moving towards altmetrics.
And so and I'll let Dean Case weigh in. There are some concerns about ResearchGate as a particular tool. But I bring this up because one of the important things, I think, is putting all this into context and having multiple measures of quality. And one of the things that ResearchGate can do that's helpful is it includes the number of reads that you get. So especially when we're looking at junior faculty who may have a limited number of publications because they're early in their career, what is an index that would give you some indication on early interest in some of these type of things? So if you're getting a lot of reads, that may be a good indication that there may be some citations further down the road. So as you mix this in, not to replace some of the other metrics, but to put into context some of those other metrics, it may be helpful as well. Now, one of the things, and when you're on ResearchGate, you get this this little graphic at the end, and you can see that I participate in no conversations in there, so that doesn't help my ResearchGate score. I'm not exactly sure what that number means per se, but it does identify that all of that score basically comes from citations of the work and not necessarily engagement in questions and answers, or apparently my followers aren't very important either. But but all those things go into context and it breaks it out. And it may be an important thing to identify that you're engaging in conversations. There may be a lot of questions in that field. And if you're identified as someone who can answer those questions as they get into your queue and you're involved, that could be a good indicator as well. So you want to talk a little bit about some of the concerns about ResearchGate?
So Dean Ingersoll's followers score has gone up because I clicked on him and followed him last night. So you're going. But there's also a good point here. In a lot of these different metrics, they can be manipulated by the researcher themselves, by their friends getting more citations, or by journal editors that want to increase their journal impact factor by the types of articles they might publish, the number of articles they might publish, and the number of citations to their own journals. Editorial comment on ResearchGate, and there are a number of other websites that could fall into this category. There is copyright law all over the world, and as academics, we rely on publishers to disseminate our research. We can't do it by ourselves. We rely on international publishers to produce the work and to make sure it gets in appropriate library indexing tools into Google and to subscribers. There is a lot of illegally uploaded content in ResearchGate for which copyright fees or subscription fees haven't been paid. And there are several international lawsuits against ResearchGate. So I would caution all of you, when you're uploading material, make sure that you have the right to be able to do so. Some publishers are flexible and will allow you to post your research on your personal website. Other publishers do not allow that.
Contact the editor or look up author guidelines?
That would be the first place to start. And they will check if they don't have the answer, hopefully they do, with the publisher. This also is a for-profit company, but even if it were just a goodwill product, I think publishers would be concerned about this. That's it.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
Where does their profit come from? Because you can join for free.
Yeah, I'm going to assume ad revenue, other data streams. I'm not familiar with all the technicalities of the lawsuit against the publisher, but profit was something that has been cited. Sorry, I don't have an answer for you on that. Article impact. Is this me or you?
It's both of us.
All right. Let's hit the next slide.
Yeah, all right. And then this is just you, but the introduction was both of us. And so the article one is just the one other way to characterize that by article. And I think particularly in early reviews where the number of publications are reasonable number, breaking down and talking about each of those could be a very important thing. And so some of these metrics around the article influence could be, I think would be of value. So, yeah.
Yeah, I gave the example earlier of one of my former colleagues making the case that her article was valuable, and she provided a variety of data. It's a good thing to talk about how awesome your work is in as many ways as possible. Where you publish, who you are, and the impact of individual articles. Again, you see a variance in the number of citations because of what's being indexed by those data sources. These numbers, 3 of the 4 are up to date as of yesterday. 1 is not, and that's the Scopus 93+. For the journal metrics, all of those metrics I showed, all 5, you can get to that data. It is either free, such as Schemago, Eigenfactor, SNP, and CiteScore. Journal Impact Factor is not a free product, but our library subscribes to it. So all 5 of the journal metric data talked about today, you can get to. We do not, and many libraries do not, have a subscription to the Scopus product. So some of the article impact data will not be available to you. Certainly Web of Science, you can get ResearchGate and Google Scholar, 2 free products and 1 that the library is subscribing to.
And not the article that's used here as an example, but another paper of mine has a fair number of citations, but if you go in and you look at those, people are not citing that article properly. They're attributing to things that have nothing to do with that article, but you know, sometimes articles just get, as a matter of course, included in a citation for those type of things. And the reason I point that out is because I think it's important to understand that. Because if someone else digs into your stuff and they see that and you haven't commented on that, you know, I think you need to be responsible and reasonable in how you report those things. And so if half of the citations on that are improperly used, that may be, you know, maybe you spin that a different way. There's so much interest that everybody wants to cite this for everything, but I think it's important to understand the source of those type of things, because you don't want to misrepresent that work either, right? And of course, you could also be in an interesting situation where, and I don't think that's the case with this article, but it could be that it's so flawed that everybody's commenting on that and they're citing it as the way not to do something. You know, that's a tough one too, but someone else could look into that as much as anything and see who's citing you as you go. When you look at these articles in Web of Science, for example, and you do a citation report, it'll say, you know, 98, for example, and if you click on that number, it lists all of the articles that have cited that particular paper. And you can go into those papers and see the context in which they cited that. And if they all say, you know, this is a really important insight and this helps us advance this, that's great. If it says the design on this is flawed and you can't interpret it, that's a different situation. So how you're going to handle that, you know, that's a personal choice. But you know, the blade can cut both ways on that type of thing. So.
And this example also points something else out. There are multiple authors here, and what does that mean? It will be up to you to explain what your contribution was to that article. Yeah, good there. Altmetrics. stands for alternative metrics. What's an alternative to the standard scientific literature citation? And where can we go to find additional data? There is news media. I have an example again of a former colleague at my previous institution. And it wasn't, it was about an exhibit and an academic symposium that my colleague had put on. It was picked up by 800 different media outlets around the world with thousands of references to the exhibit and the symposium. We would argue that that means something. Most of us will never have a story mentioning us picked up by 800 international news outlets. So news media is one area where we can look for this. And a lot of publishers, especially book publishers, are starting to gather this data and making it available to authors. There's also social media. I mentioned the like. But we can also mine tweets. There are scientists on Twitter, and there are lots of non-scientists talking about science on Twitter. That data may be valuable to some of us. We can justify that, well, we've blown up Twitter with one of our research articles. And we saw in ResearchGate there are things like page views, downloads. There are some examples. I provide 3 different altmetric data sources. One is an open source. The other 2 are commercial products, but it's worth clicking on their 2 websites to get a look at the different kinds of data that those companies are collecting. Some of our library products and other news and scientific information resources out there partner with altmetric and Plum Analytics, so that when you're using something like a library database or some other scientific information source, you may be presented with some of that altmetric data, including about your own research. Next slide.
So we talked a lot about, as it relates to articles, the specific metrics that you can get relative to that. I think it's important to include qualitative information as well. And so an example, if you get reviewer or editor comments for your particular paper or a grant submission that you've included, I think it's important to include some of those comments. And I've given some extreme examples, but if you submitted a paper and the editor said this is the best article I've ever reviewed in my 30 years in the prevention, that should make its way to your dossier, I would argue. Or if they say this is well-designed, well-written article that changes the way we look at our profession, I'm using general made-up ones, but oftentimes there are some very positive comments about certain things that may be included in that article. Don't overlook those as a source of information to include in your dossier to build the argument that your work has impact and value.
You're talking about email correspondence?
Yeah, that could be in the reviews that you get back through email or on that article. You could do that. In the olden days, I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember the reprint requests, right? You get the postcard from all over the world, and you'd put those in your dossier to show, see, this is important because lots of people are asking to get a reprint of this article. Well, you can kind of get to that in different ways, but it's just another piece of information. So if in the reviews, and if you want to include the raw reviews, I suppose you could, but if there are some comments that speak to the quality or impact of that, I would definitely include those as well. I think I'm still up. Yep. If you're, by the way, if you win the Nobel Prize, make sure to include that in your dossier. That would be really important. But in all seriousness, if you've received any awards for your particular articles, that's really important to point out as well. Because the people may not go and read the piece itself, or it may be denoted on the article that it's the winner of some sort of award. So it's important to point that out. When you do that, identify the competitiveness of the award, what it's intended to recognize, and so on and so forth. So if I won the top research prize in my profession, how many of you would recognize the name of that article as being the most important research prize in my profession? Maybe one of you, right? The others may not recognize that. So you have to tell people that. So if you put that into context and say, I won the Jones Award for best article in this thing, say this is picked once a year. There's one winner, and the folks who have done that are the leaders in the profession. That all of that information is really important for the folks who are reading your dossier. Okay. There are some other pieces of information that you can certainly include in your dossier as well when you're talking about the impact of your scholarship. And I just collectively called them esteem measures. And if you are elected as a fellow of your organization, I think that's an important thing to include. And the criteria, why you're, how many people are selected as fellows, what are the criteria, I think that's important. If you've gotten a competitive research fellowship, for example, include that information and contextualize it for your reader. If you've been selected as an editor or a reviewer for a major journal, I think that speaks to your reputation in your field. Include that. There are research awards, not just for articles, but maybe, and I'm thinking particularly in junior faculty who are building their dossier, if they've won the New Investigator Award for their profession, that would be important to include. If you're invited to be on a grant panel for a federal agency, for example, definitely include that type of information as well. So the reason in pointing these things out is I don't think the way to use the metrics that we've just talked about is just to drop that metric and expect everybody to interpret that for you. Put it into context with all of the other things that you have. Context is a really important piece here. So putting it all together, okay, and we've kind of hinted that as we've gone along, but so we have all of this information, right? And there are all these different metrics that you could possibly use. There's some qualitative information that you can use. And you need to think about all of this certainly in the context of your elaborations, right? And so the elaborations may describe the requirements for your scholarly work in different ways. So I'll use the ones from the College of Health and Human Services as an example. So when we talk about, we have a number for the number of articles, research articles, but it also indicates that it needs to be indexed. It doesn't say what index, right? And we've presented a number of different indices that could draw from. So those are the criteria, to meet relative to that. So then we have all these metrics. Go ahead and go to the next one. It's important to use multiple measures of impact, right? And frankly, if I just saw one, my thought would be one of two things, that either that was just a cherry-picked one and it's hard to put it into context, or I may not know how to interpret that. So you have to help me out. And so in the chart that Bo showed earlier, where it had the scores for some of the journals, for example, one of the things that I've seen start to appear, for example, is in a bibliometric format, a person would list their articles and then put the journal impact factor in parentheses at the end of that citation. Well, that I guess is a step forward in that they're thinking about what those metrics are, but I don't know if that's valuable or not. Somewhere along the line, for journal impact factor, for example, someone decided that a measurement of 2.0 was like the cutoff, right? The stuff that had more than 2.0 was good and less than 2.0 wasn't so good. Now the interesting thing is, if we were to look across all the disciplines and look at where a journal falls with an impact factor of 2.0, you're going to find in some professions that's going to be in the top quartile. In other professions, it's going to be in the bottom quartile. So it just depends. And so one of the ways of thinking about characterizing that is, rather than putting the journal impact factor, is go ahead and put the score and then put the ranking, so 8 of 104 or whatever that might be, and then the quartile that that's in, right? And I don't think that the expectation is that every journal is going to be the top journal in that area across the board, because there are lots of other reasons that you select a specific journal, and you need to know what's in that subject category.
A little bit, in addition, on the journal impact factor score, in biomedicine, the mean is something like 3.7, but the field of biology, the mean is something like 1.3. So tremendous difference across disciplines of what an average score might be.
Yep. And even providing the rest of that context. So let's say I identified a journal article as being ranked 18th out of 30. So put it in like about the third quartile. And I'll use one of the categories that is in my area, so rehabilitation, right? And rehabilitation includes rehabilitation journals across a lot of different areas. So in general, there's kind of neuro ones and there's orthopedic ones. And the neuro ones have a lot more people working in them, right? And a lot more papers in that particular area than the orthopedic. So even though those two are in the same category, the neuro ones are going to tend to be ranked higher than the orthopedic ones. So what do you do about that? Well, you put it into context. So if you take if you look at the journals that are in that particular subject area, and you say, of all the orthopedic rehab journals, it's ranked maybe 18th of all of them, but it's the top ranked orthopedic journal in that. So that would be, for the kind of work that I do, that would be the highest ranked journal that you would publish in, right? So the people who are reading your dossier are not going to know that. You have to tell them that, right? So putting that into context is a really important thing. We talked a little bit about some of these other things. Great journals can publish lousy articles, and they often do, right? But they also publish some that have a tremendous amount of citations, which is how their number gets higher, right? Because it's an average. Great articles can be published in lower ranked journals. And I bet if you take your work and you plot the number of citations versus the impact factor of the journal, you'll get more or less a scatter plot, right? You're going to have articles in lower ranked journals that have a lot of citations, and you may have some in higher ranked journals with lower ones. So you can see it's important to put all of that into context. I think an important thing to point out, and I've mentioned this a couple times, is some of the metrics may not capture progress in early career scholars. And so the H-index is a good example of that. And so if you have someone with a half dozen or so publications, they can't have an H-index any higher than 6, right? Because that would be 6 papers cited 6 or more times. And so if one person has a H-index of 6 and the other one has 5, I mean, how much different is that? Is that really help differentiate in that case? Maybe not. Now, on the other hand, if you're a junior faculty member going up for promotion and tenure and you have an H-index of 35, I would report that all day long because that would be very good for someone at that point in their career, for example. So, you have to be careful. So some of the other things, the alt metrics, and that's one of the reasons I pointed out ResearchGate, right? If you can start showing that people are reading this even before it becomes cited, I think that's helpful too in terms of giving some indication not only on what they've accomplished thus far, but also on potential. Because when you do promotion and tenure reviews, that's one of the things you're looking at, right? Is that their potential going forward. So triangulate these numbers, have multiple measures, put them into context, and let the reader know how that the general picture is representing quality, right, and impact, and put them into context. So raw numbers for any of these type of things are not particularly helpful. And frankly, a lot of the arguments that you read about, and there's plenty of arguments in the literature about all of these metrics, talk about the improper use of these metrics. So it may be instructive to read those so that you don't use them improperly, right? So put them into the proper context, and I think they're a lot more helpful, but no one metric is going to be the tell-all for the whole palette of what is someone's scholarly activity. So in the professional activity statement, this is just some suggestions in terms of the kind of questions you might think about answering in your portfolio when you're preparing it. So the kind of problems you're trying to solve with your research and why it's important to your field. And when writing this, you have to think about the audience who's going to read that. And the audience is going to be less and less familiar with your profession as you move through the chain. So at the department level, I would argue not everybody even knows what might be in that. You move it up to the college level, even fewer people are going to understand what you're doing. And you go to the university level, you'll be lucky if there's somebody in that group that understands that. So you have to put that into context that anybody in our academic community would understand what it is that you're trying to solve, right? Describe your current research in the context of your research big picture. And I think it's helpful, particularly in the early phases, to demonstrate how you're lining up your research with where your big idea is going relative to that. It's understood that you have to have some level of focus to solve the problem that you're at, but where are you going with this? And the extent to which you can articulate that not only helps the reader of your dossier, but checking back with that is helpful for you as you think of building your scholarly career. How have you progressed towards becoming an independent scholar? And good examples of this, we often get folks that come in maybe as they're in their first position here, and they have some work that they did with their doctoral advisor. And some of that, of course, continues on past the time that they're there. So what are the things that are going on that will help that person uses to demonstrate that they're separating and becoming their own independent scholar? So talking about that is helpful. And then talking about providing the evidence that your research is having an impact. And this is the metrics that we talked about, in proper context along the way. And then, how does your research show promise for ongoing publications and external funding, which is the sort of a trajectory type of thing. The information that an individual is going to write are going to be as different across all the areas as you can possibly imagine. So it would be difficult in some regards, and I know a common thing is to say, well, let me see a portfolio that was successful in promotion and tenure. And that might be helpful in some regard with the formatting of how that's organized, but it's going to be really difficult to use some of the ideas that other people did because everybody has a unique area that they're exploring. So as you're thinking about developing your portfolio or you're mentoring people who are developing their portfolio, those are some important things I think to keep in mind. Most of the metrics that we have may or may not be discussed very regularly in lab groups or in department meetings or those type of things. So it's not surprising if folks aren't well acquainted with what these metrics are. So a suggestion that I would have, either if you're developing your own portfolio or you're mentoring someone, is get in touch with your librarian. And the librarian can help you find these metrics, talk about what they mean, and begin to help in that regard. Now, most of them, as Bo had mentioned, you can find most of these yourself, and if you know what they mean, that's fine, but understanding the proper interpretation of those is really important. And again, if you want to use multiple measures, that means you have to go out and find different things and pull it all together for yourself. Yeah, next. So in there, clearly stating the professional activity requirements described in your elaborations and how you meet or exceed those. And this one is, having reviewed a fair number of these, I'm saying help me out here, right? Talk about what the elaborations say that you need to do, and then tell me how you meet or exceed that. And so there's quantitative requirements and there's quality requirements. Be clear with the reader how you've met that. I think that's extremely helpful for the readers, and I think it's also helpful as it moves through the system to help all the different committees understand where that sits, because ultimately they're making a recommendation based on their interpretation of whether you did or did not meet the requirements articulated in the elaborations. If it's a pre-tenure review describing how you're on track to meet the requirements described in the elaborations and your plan to get there. And I think that last part is often forgotten. Here's where I'm at right now, and where am I going with that, or what are my plans, is helpful to include as well. Dr. White sent me an excellent question relative to this, and I wanted to include that, and Bo talked a little bit about that, and that is the concept of authorship. And I don't think there's a good answer to that because it's interpreted a lot of different ways. Here's my cut at this, right? So it's not uncommon to have multiple authors within an article, and when you get these metrics, it doesn't differentiate whether you're the first author, the second author, or the third author, or the last author. If you're an author, you get just as much credit as anybody else in that author group. And so the metrics in and of themselves don't delineate the responsibility of the individuals in that. So I'm going to argue that it's the responsibility of the candidate to describe what their role was in each of those. Some things that might be helpful in that regard, and you don't need to necessarily be submitting articles to this, but a number of journals identify criteria for being included as an author, and some even require that you disclose the role of everybody that's in that. And so it may say that they were responsible for the writing, they had the conception of the idea, they run the statistics, and multiple authors may have different ones. That's a way that you could identify what your role was in that particular study. Now, whether to try to get to, well, you should get 27% of the credit for this or that, I think that would be extremely difficult to do along the way. A companion thought with that is the order of authors means different things in different professions, and you've got to delineate that, or you have to be clear about that. So I think in most fields, being the first author has some meaning and value, but in some professions like mine, being the last author is an important spot, because that means you're the senior author on that article. So you may have a laboratory and you have this person is taking the lead on this study, and this person's taking the lead on this study. So that could be that may be the convention in that. Now, of course, any description is subject to abuse, right? And if that's not the common thing in that profession, and someone happens to be the last author and they claim to be the senior author in the paper, but they're the most junior person in the group, that may have a different meaning. The elaborations may or may not identify that, and I think if they don't identify the value of the author order, that's going to be a difficult thing to discuss. If they talk about that, then that's the criteria, right? The elaborations are the criteria that individuals need to meet. So if it talks about needing to be, and some, for example, might say you need X number of articles and you need to be first author on, half of them. That might be what's identified. Then you would need to, that's the criteria. If that criteria is not appropriate, or that authorship order doesn't mean what it used to, then it would be valuable to revisit that so that people can properly characterize and get credit for their involvement in that process. So,
next slide is my favorite slide for more information. Again, this is just an overview. There's a lot more to the metrics. If you want to know more, please consult with our library faculty. Again, there's one assigned to every college and often to departments within a college. Our library also has a live guide on citation analysis authored by Wade Lee, who is here today. It gives a good overview of this topic. And I also provide links here to the 5 journal ranking sources that I mentioned today. You can Google Schemago, which is SJR, SNP, and the others. This paid product, Journal Impact Factor, that URL will be changing in the next 2 weeks. we have a new authentication service that we will be using. But again, it's a library resource. You go to the library's homepage. There will be a link to this. And perhaps your favorite slide. Oh, yes, questions?
That's the next slide, as a matter of fact. Tell me.
I have a comment and just a quick story. So on Faculty 180, they are requiring impact factor. So I think that's a good thing to enter, but to move this forward on Faculty 180, maybe including the quartiles and the rankings where you have to put that in with each journal, is something to consider, the university should consider in terms of more accurately identifying where people's works are.
Good. Good. Let me repeat that so that it's heard on there. So the comment was about entering journal impact factors in Faculty 180, which is currently available. And the recommendation was to look to include some of those other characteristics like the quartile or the ranking in addition to that so it can be properly contextualized. And I think that's really important, but remember, a lot of it is in the professional statement, and so you have to make sure that you use that, put that as well as those numbers. But
Also note that these scores change. These journal metrics that were on the previous slide, those are annual scores, so they're updated annually. So these numbers will change. So if it's on your CV or in Faculty 180, that figure that you report will have to be updated regularly.
The other thing, just a quick story. So I have probably 60 some odd publications, and I had a student come up to me once and he wanted to do research on hookah, and I reluctantly agreed to do it. We did a little study with just UT students, cross-sectional, very, very simple statistics. And just because of the name of hookah and the trend that was going on at the time, one of my most highly cited articles, but probably one of my weakest articles, if I'm being honest. So that's, that's a good indication of the problem with just chasing citations.
Mm-hmm. Well, and along that line, so the comment was about topics that might be popular within the population might get more citations because people are interested in it, but it could be a flash in the pan kind of thing. There's also the types of articles can influence these metrics as well. So, for example, and I'm not giving this as a recommendation, but review articles and technique articles tend to get cited a lot more than a study on a specific area. And so sometimes those become necessary, right? You're doing your research and you have a method that you're using, and the reviewers keep saying, that this method has not been peer reviewed. So you say, okay, we're going to go back and we're going to write a methods paper, and the methods paper goes out, and you use that to justify the methods that you use to solve this particular problem. And then others start to use it too because they don't want to have to keep justifying that. Well, that gets cited a lot, but how much is that advancing knowledge in that area, right? It's just allowing people to say, this has been used before, now here's the interesting information. So, that needs to be considered as well. Yeah.
On the previous slide with all the links, are those links available on the citation library guide as well?
I'll let Wade Lee Smith answer that question. The question was, these links here, are they on the live guide on citation analysis?
They are on the citation analysis lib guide. It goes through it basically by the source, so whether it's Scopus or Web of Science data, and so I'll make sure that those links are there.
The answer is the citation analysis guide talks about data sources such as Scopus and Web of Science. We will make sure that links are provided there as well. One-stop shopping, that's what the library likes to do. So thank you.
Yeah. Dr. Brady?
Where do patent publications fit into all this?
Question was, where do patent
The publications, they
Yep.
recognize significant work.
And so the question was about publication of patent information. I think that's going to vary by college or department that may or may not be involved with that. Whether they're included or not, I've not studied all of them to know. But I think if it's an important part of that profession, it should be included in the elaborations as getting credit, but I don't know if it is. So I think it'd be important to check on that. And the reason I suggest that is if you put a lot of effort into that and it's not counting, that would be, that could have detrimental effects for that. On the flip side, if that's an important part of what happens within that profession, then advocating for some change in the elaboration so that that's included, I think is a good idea.
Part of the reason I asked the question is that citations of patents, and, yes, you publish a patent, but you've given a whole protocol figure for interpreting the value of that. But I don't see anything having to do with patents here.
Yeah, so the data sources Scopus and Web of Science, they index scientific literature and periodicals. They're not indexing other things like patents. However, the citation data they're collecting are in these data sources. And Wade Lee Smith has a comment, I believe.
So the Web of Science database will track the number of citations to an individual patent
Right.
in article. So it doesn't track patent citations, from like a patent examiner what other ones have been examined. And obviously there is no impact factor associated because it's not collected into a journal. But you can look up your individual patents in Web of Science as a cited work and determine the number of articles
Yep.
you've cited.
The follow-up from Wade Lee Smith is the Web of Science product will track citations to patents. And if you go into the Web of Science database, there are multiple ways you can use that database. You can search for authors or a topic. You can also search for cited authors and cited publications, and that's what you would use for patent to get the citations to a patent data.
In the hard sciences now, they're looking at the amount of research money brought in, and grants, contracts, dollars in the door, particularly from government agencies where you can stick overhead on them. They are directly related, a lot of those, to patents. If somebody's getting patents, they're probably because they got a lot of external funding that's coming in, at least university wise. So I think they are relevant. If I'm speaking as a patent attorney.
Yep. So the discussion about patents, and actually we didn't talk about grants or some of those type of things as it relates to professional activity, but there are different, again, the elaborations I think are the document that describes what's included or not included in the review of individuals. And many of the elaborations do talk about grants or contracts as well. And I'm not sure about, in engineering, is patents included as well?
Yeah. So I was going to comment, we had to look at this, and I think we're actually in the process of reviewing our elaborations for this and many other issues, because one of the problems with patents is if you want to go for a patent, you can't publish your work.
That's right.
You can't make it public until you actually file for it and get the patent.
Right.
So that has affected some researchers when they put in their applications for promotion.
You cannot publish, you don't want to be publishing, you got the statutory bars under 101, and you don't want to be publishing before you file your patent application. And even then, a lot of times, you want to keep the whole thing trade secret while the patent's pending. So you're kind of bottled up with grants. Grants may actually work against immediate filing of papers. Not to say it won't come out in the long run.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Ellen, I think all of those factors in terms of the ability of an individual to meet the expectations articulated in the elaborations is an important thing to think about. And if some of those activities are going to be delayed to the point where they don't get considered during those time periods, I think there needs to be an important discussion, because we don't want people to be in a situation where they're doing great things and they're unable to be successful here, right? So if elaborations don't reflect what the important and necessary work is, then those ought to be reviewed and changed to reflect that. But I would hate to, as valuable as patents are, I would hate to recommend that to someone if it puts them in a track where they're not going to be successful with promotion and tenure. Other questions or thoughts?
We thank all of you for coming. And thanks.
Let's give them a hand, please. Very, very nice job, great information. Please take time and fill out an evaluation. If you did not get one, I have some. We use that obviously to help improve our session. So thanks again, and hopefully we'll see you in December for our next Future of Higher Education Forum. Thank you.
So we'll take these scores and we'll divide them by the number of people.